and very much welcome Professor Björn Alpermann from Würzburg University, who holds the chair of contemporary China studies at that university since 2013, but has also worked there before as a junior professor. Professor Alpermann is a well-known scholar in the China studies field, nationally and internationally, has a broad array of different topics, but basically he works on local politics in China, works basically on, an understanding of the Chinese political system, works on population issues and also minority issues. So he has a relatively broad portfolio. And what I like very much with him is that he is also very much interested in theorizing Chinese politics. And he's also somebody who works at the brink of political science and sociology, so also with quite an interdisciplinary perspective on the field, which is always very helpful. So Björn, we are very happy that you're here. You're going to provide us with some provocative thoughts today, and the digital audience is yours.
Okay, let me share my screen. So, hello everyone. Thank you, Gunther, for the nice introductory words and for the invitation here. I remember a presentation I once attended by an archaeologist in which the speaker introduced the audience to the remnants of a rotund structure he described as a sacral building. One listener asked how he could be so sure about the function of that structure. To this, the presenter replied that, of course, what he was talking about was only his theory, and the beauty of archaeology was exactly the fact that anyone could have their own theories as to how the evidence unearthed should be interpreted. When it comes to the field of Chinese elite politics, I often feel that we are very much in the same situation. This colloquium sets out to study major trends in Chinese politics under Xi Jinping, and I was asked to give a relatively short, if possible, thought-provoking presentation, and that will allow for extensive debate and discussion afterwards, and I'm trying to oblige. The international literature on Xi's new era presents him as a deeply transformative political leader who has changed the way that Chinese politics is run. The bulk of the authors seem to concur that he has personalized political power to an extent unprecedented in the post-Mao period. Some see a modern-day Mao in him, who is increasingly wielding his heft without any major inhibitions. Many use the term strongman rule, although hardly defined, to characterize this new state of affairs in China's political system. In fact, this characterization has almost become something of a conventional wisdom, and a typical example of this assessment would be the one by Düben, which was recently given. By amassing more power than any other Chinese leader in the reform era, Xi has been steering China firmly in the direction of a conventional authoritarian strongman regime devoid of effective institutional guide rails that might prove progressively incapable of overseeing one of the world's leading economies and one of its most complex societies. So today I want to ask and answer three interrelated questions, namely, what exactly has Xi been doing, to what end is he doing it, and how has he accomplished it so far? My answer to that first question, what has Xi been doing, is already hinted at in the title of today's talk. Xi has undertaken a program, an extensive program of what I call illiberal institutionalization. Early on in the reform era, key proponents of the so-called fragmented authoritarianism model, such as Kenneth Lieberthal, discussed institutionalization in the Chinese political system. I quote, "It becomes necessary to draw a distinction between organizations and institutions, for the Chinese political system is strewn with organizations that have not become institutions. Organizations are coherent, internally interdependent, administrative or functional structures. Institutions, by contrast, are practices, relationships, and organizations that have developed sufficient regularity and perceived importance to shape the behavior of their members," unquote. So in other words, there are many formal bodies or organizations which do not actually possess the powers formally vested in them. And there are other actors which possess much more power than they are formally supposed to have due to personal or informal factors. The process of developing from mere formal organization into an institution in Lieberthal's sense is called institutionalization. Now, this is a key concept in political science with a long pedigree. In brief, it means that formal rules and organizations actually achieve meaning and authority. China's polity has been undergoing institutionalization since it re-emerged from the Cultural Revolution, and since Deng Xiaoping's time, a close connection has been seen between institutionalization and a better functioning of the system, overcoming the inertia of fragmentation. Similarly, the proponents of authoritarian resilience have pushed institutionalization to the fore as a key factor in explaining the CCP's surprisingly long-lasting grip on power. Andrew Nathan, in the article which introduced the term authoritarian resilience in 2003, placed his focus on, and I quote, 4 aspects of the CCP's regime's institutionalization. First, the increasingly norm-bound nature of its succession politics. Second, the increase in meritocratic as opposed to factional considerations in the promotion of political elites. Third, the differentiation and functional specialization of institutions within the regime. And fourth, the establishment of institutions for political participation and appeal that strengthen the CCP's legitimacy among the public at large. In conclusion, Nathan argues that first, in order to adapt and survive, the regime has had to do many of the things predicted by Talcott Parsons and those who elaborated his theory. The regime has had to first abandon utopian ideology and charismatic styles of leadership. Second, empower a technocratic elite. Third, introduce bureaucratic regularization, complexity, and specialization. And fourth, reduce control over private speech and action. Second, contrary to the Parsonian prediction, these adaptations have not led to regime change, unquote. So this led him to entertain what he called, I quote again, a more disturbing possibility that authoritarianism is a viable regime form even under conditions of advanced modernization and integration with the global economy, unquote. In other words, institutionalization, if done right, might lead to regime stability and survival. Conversely, detractors of Nathan's new concept, such as Bruce Gilley, writing in the same issue of the Journal of Democracy as Nathan did, they reject the proposal because they dispute the evidence for institutionalization, but they do concur that institutionalization would bring more stability. Note, however, that institutionalization in this debate is always understood as positive changes, what I would call liberal institutionalization. Regularization of succession, rise of meritocracy, functional differentiation, and broader participation. Against the backdrop of these debates, Xi's approach to governing China has often been described as deinstitutionalization or a dismantling of institutions. By the above logic, this should introduce a higher degree of instability and reduce the chances of regime survival. Instead of a semi-institutionalized process of leadership promotion, selection, and turnover, Xi has put paid to a regularized changing of the guard every 10 years, basically installing himself for life. There is in fact no shortage of rules, formal as well as informal ones, that have been altered, bended, or broken by Xi in his effort to amass power, by some accounts at least. And yet I argue that this interpretation overlooks important issues. There is a third possibility beyond deinstitutionalized and personalistic rule, as well as liberal institutionalization, namely illiberal institutionalization. My core argument is that this is Xi's third way. He has been at least as productive in creating new institutions and revising old ones than he has been at dismantling the existing ones. Now, I lack the time here to delve into the details, but we can see this at the most elite level of the political system, where personalistic rule should be the most obvious. Just think of the many central level leading small groups, or LSGs, that he initiated, almost invariably with himself at the helm. These are some of the clearest manifestations of what is called top-level design, the idea that has risen to prominence under Xi. By placing some of them above the existing topmost political bodies, Xi has created a new institutional layer that is directly under his control. In the field of security, it is the National Security, LSG, that outranks the previous highest organ in that area, the Central Politics and Law Commission. More prominent still is the Central Comprehensively Deepening Reform, LSG, that centralizes decisions on almost anything. Both of these bodies were initiated in late 2013 with the third plenum of the Central Committee that is widely seen to contain Xi's ruling agenda. And along with several others, this LSG, the latter one, has been elevated to become a commission instead of an LSG in early 2018. This is another crucial step in formalizing and institutionalizing their authority. In total, this reform in 2018 created a set of 7 upgraded or newly created leading commissions, plus 2 new LSGs at the central level. The creation of these new political organs and the fact that Xi has commonly taken the seat as the chairman of these, earning him the moniker COE, or chairman of everything, have usually been interpreted as demonstrating the extent of his personalization of power, and conversely, the undermining of pre-existing institutions, such as collective decision-making and a division of labor between the top leaders in Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee. I beg to differ. Keeping in mind Lieberthal's quote above, we can also take a different perspective. In the Chinese political system, all too often, the personal authority outranks the formal institutional authority. This means we cannot take it for granted that the creation of new organs is meant to enhance the authority of the leader, no matter how impressive his list of titles becomes. Instead, it may very well be intended to work the other way around. The personal authority of the leader is used to bolster the standing of the newly created institution. In other words, the new bodies are vested with authority, which is nothing but institutionalization in the sense defined above. What may be considered as evidence to this that this latter interpretation is the correct one? I argue that the sheer number of top positions that Xi Jinping has nominally taken on is one such indication. No single individual can ever be expected to truly execute their power over such an extensive span of control. Therefore, Xi is more likely to serve as a figurehead on many of these LSGs and commissions, with his deputies becoming all the more important. This means that, while overseen by the core leader, these organs will develop a certain autonomy vis-à-vis this authority figure by default. By setting up new organs that systematically fuse party and state power, Xi is using illiberal institutionalization to strengthen the CCP, but not necessarily his own faction or personal power. A prominent example could be the National Supervisory Commission, newly set up in March 2018. It provides a front for the party's Central Discipline and Inspection Commission, CDIC, to directly enter the government and bureaucracy. The combined powers of the two actors, which are actually just one, extends even further to include not just party members, but virtually anyone holding a public office. The 2018 amendments to the state constitution set up the National Supervisory Commission as a constitutional organ on a par with the judicial organs, the Supreme People's Court and Procuratorate. This may be inspired by the control yuan envisaged by Sun Yat-sen in his writings about the 5 branches of government. But it is primarily a further formalization of the previous informal practice to use the Ministry of Supervision as the CDIC's front organization. Hence the term illiberal institutionalization. Along with these organizational changes, crucial procedural developments have also taken place. Most ominously, the former opaque Shuangui detention system has been replaced by the now formal, but not any more transparent Liuzhi detention. Again, the crucial difference is that the former only pertained to party members, while any public servant can be subject to the latter. This brings to mind Noakes' assessment of the abolition of the reform through labor or Lao Jiao system. I quote, However, the conversion of conventional reform through labor methods to a more flexible and pragmatic model under Xi does not signify the advance of human rights or the slow but steady softening of the regime. Rather, the shift to new forms of administrative detention is fundamentally about retaining the party's power through a shrewd mix of control, co-optation, and the prospect of renewed legitimacy through more socially responsive governance, unquote. In both cases of detention reform, institutionalization is not having the effect of taming, but of enhancing the party's power as an organization. Examples such as these abound in Xi's China, and I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, let's move on to the second question. To what end is Xi doing all this? To some extent, I've given my answer already. Although the evidence can be read in different ways, I submit that we need to more seriously consider the possibility that Xi is doing all of this, not only for his own advancement, but rather for the sake of a more stable, capable, and durable party. This point was recently made by various scholars covering different aspects. In her State of the Field article on Xi's anti-corruption campaign, Carolyn Kautz, for instance, found that there are basically two camps of scholars. One group views the campaign basically as a manifestation of hardball power politics and factionalism, while the other assumes that Xi's goal is to fix the party in terms of organizational strength and coherence. In contrast to this either-or that she finds in the literature, Kautz argues that a more fruitful approach would see these as complementary perspectives. In my own view, the concept of illiberal institutionalization bridges this gap between the two sides. It helps to understand that personal power may be a means to an end rather than an end in itself for Xi Jinping. In another recent assessment, Nimrod Baranovich forcefully argues against the thesis that Xi conducted a power grab to amass personal power. While he's not attempting to downplay the important leadership role of Xi, he stresses that the extent and scope of the powers that Xi has concentrated in his hands can better be explained by a consensus among party leaders and elders than by a power grab of an individual. According to Baranovich, this consensus emerged due to several crises and risks challenging party rule at around the time of Xi's installation at the top. Though I do not share all of his analysis, I think that he has a point that there is a lot of institutionalization to be observed in Xi's rise and securing of power. I concur with his view that there is more to it than just a personal soft coup, that the goal to re-centralize power may have been more widely shared among other members of the political elite. My argument here is that authors who see Xi only as amassing personal power have mistaken reconcentration of power for personalization of power. There is undoubtedly much of the former, but there is no necessity for concentrated power to be personalized instead of institutionalized. Take Min Pei's analysis of Xi Jinping's revisions to internal party rules and regulations as a case in point. First, Pei finds that Xi revised considerably more such regulations than his two immediate predecessors. Second, in qualitative terms, Pei finds that he has tackled many more of the more authoritative principles or junzi than his predecessors. And third, he even dared to change what Pei calls the most important political document crafted by Deng, namely several principles on political life in the party. This core document condensed the lessons learned from late Maoism and the destruction of intra-party rules of conduct. Pei finds that Xi's revised version tones down the original text's emphasis on collective leadership and dilutes the prohibition of a cult of personality. In their stead, it emphasizes democratic centralism and the authority of the party center. More specifically, it pushes for submitting to the core that is Xi himself. While I agree with Pei that many of these rules augment the leader's power, contributing to the rising concentration of authority in his hands, I want to stress that here that Xi is using institutionalization in order to achieve these goals. Thus, he is rebuilding the party at the same time that he is forging ahead with enhancing his own power. Assuming that you can only have one or the other is, in my view, simplistic. Rather, I submit that the core of illiberal institutionalization is the simultaneous realization of both higher power concentration and stronger institutions. Instead of treating concentration of power and institutionalization as mutually exclusive, the concept of illiberal institutionalization reconciles the two, viewing them as complementing each other. So how has he accomplished this in such a short span of time? Well, conventional wisdom, or maybe it's hope, has it that at some point Xi Jinping will face a backlash. The more enemies Xi has made for himself, the more likely it is that these opponents will band together to get back at him, the reasoning goes. Though this logic is ostensibly compelling, I think the relationship is actually the other way around. The more enemies he creates, the less opposition he has to face. Let me explain. Building on social movement theory, Andrew Nathan wrote in 2014 about the future tipping point at which a Chinese opposition movement may be triggered by a yet unforeseeable event and then cascade to become larger and larger. Quote, "What starts a cascade is the first group of ordinary citizens whose distaste for the status quo suddenly overwhelms their fear and whose fear becomes less. Once that group has acted out, the group with the next largest desire to fear ratio perceives that support for change is more widely shared than they knew, and repression more costly and less likely. This shifts their desire to fear ratio enough for them to join in the movement. This in turn affects the desire to fear ratio of those belonging to the next most fearful group who also join. In this way, an informational cascade occurs, as each shift in the publicly available information about the public mood alters the calculation of the next group," unquote. So I propose that a similar cascade has been happening under Xi Jinping, with the decisive difference that it has moved in the opposite direction toward escalating fear. Xi Jinping's anti-corruption and ideology drive has operated with a shock and awe tactic. It started with high-profile and high-value targets such as Zhou Yongkang, a former Politburo Standing Committee member and head of the powerful Central Politics and Law Committee. This was much more than just a shot across the bow. It proved only to be the opening salvo of the most sustained anti-corruption campaign ever experienced by China's political elite. In turn, Xi has taken on bastions once deemed unassailable, such as the commanding heights of the state-owned economy, the PLA, the financial sector, and private businesses. By going after big fish, Xi has signaled that no individual or organization is beyond the reach of party discipline and legal institutions. This will indubitably have scared cadres throughout the system. To show their commitment to the superior, as the supervisory agencies have also targeted many lower-ranking wrongdoers. And while this kind of justice has not been meted out even-handedly, it arguably has demonstrated that the party center is doubling down on its preferred approach to anti-corruption work, namely keeping it in-house instead of relying on independent media, judiciary, and public. More important still, this field has also seen its own fair share of institutional innovations, such as the above-mentioned National Supervisory Commission, central inspection groups, and stronger vertical accountability in the discipline inspection Xito. Not all of this is brand new, but all of this is recharged and rebranded as Xi's signature tools. With these organizational changes, Xi has turned an ad hoc anti-corruption campaign into a permanent feature of the political system via illiberal institutionalization. How can such a radical approach be justified and legitimized in front of both the public and within the party? Here, Xi Jinping has employed a method that has long been used in the political system, where we find a strong follow the leader effect in political language use. I call this ideological layering. And it works like this. First, a new or aspiring leader takes some elements of the previous leader's statement, then he gives them a new twist by adding slightly to these. And second, because these formulations, at least at first, stay within the speech space of an accepted authority figure, this is beyond criticism. However, once a new leader has made a formulation his own, he can reload it with additional or even contrasting content. In Xi's case, the most obvious example is the slogan of the four comprehensives, or 四个全面. These are comprehensively building a moderately well-off society, comprehensively deepening reforms, comprehensively governing the nation by law, and comprehensively governing the party through strictness. By adding the innocuous sounding word 全面 or comprehensive to an existing maxim originally introduced by Deng Xiaoping, such as 小康社会 or well-off society, and 依法治国, govern the nation according to law, Xi has significantly expanded the meaning of these terms. I argue that he has indeed supercharged these concepts so that they can take on a radically more far-reaching meaning. Of greatest concern to my argument here is 全面依法治国, which in a nutshell is equivalent in many ways with the concept of illiberal institutionalization that I have outlined. It entails taking the law, even when it is clearly not fulfilling the requirements of a liberal rule of law, as an instrument to achieve illiberal aims like strengthening authoritarian rule. What recently Qianfan Zhang has presented as a failure of judicial reforms concentrating power in the judiciary, to my mind, is the success of illiberal institutionalization and the essence of 全面依法治国. The tension between party power and judicial professionalism and independence has been inherent in Deng's efforts to reconstruct the legal system after Mao from the start. However, under Xi, the pendulum has swung decidedly in the direction of using the law unabashedly to achieve the perpetuation of party power. Again, treating these as mutually exclusive goals is only the perspective of the analyst, in this case, Zhang, and certainly not Xi's view. For him, in order to attain both goals simultaneously, one has to double down on the oxymoronic idea of a socialist rule of law. 全面依法治国, therefore, is Deng Xiaoping on steroids. It is not new to the world, but pursued with a previously unknown determination. So to conclude, today I have laid out the first exposition of illiberal institutionalization as a concept that aims to capture the essence of Xi Jinping's approach to governing China. The argument is that we need to move beyond the binary of institutionalization versus deinstitutionalization and ask what kind of institutionalization is happening, how it proceeds, and for what ultimate purpose. I submit that Xi has created an abundance of new institutions and revised old ones with the goal of strengthening party authority rather than only his personal authority. His personal authority does play a role, but it could well be that it is deliberately used in order to bolster the standing of the newly created organs rather than the other way around. He has been able to do so through a combination of tactics and methods, two of which I highlighted. The first is the shock and awe strategy of his anti-corruption drive, and the second is ideological layering. These work hand in hand since the latter provides the ideological cover for the former's attack. I have also suggested that instead of creating an ever-growing coalition of enemies, he has succeeded, at least for now, in demobilizing any opposition through cascading fear. I'm not yet at the stage where I would say that my explanation given above is certainly the more compelling compared to any alternatives. However, I am sure that it will pay off to think through these alternative interpretations of the evidence before everyone is falling in line with the now almost conventional assumption of strongman rule. For maybe the rotund structure was indeed being used for sacred purposes, but maybe not. That is the beauty of theorizing. Thank you.